For almost 1,000 years, this churchyard has been a focal point in the village of Lee. The tower, which you can see behind me, going back 8 centuries, is all that remains of 2 earlier churches. Bells, which would have summoned generations to worship, might well have persuaded Jack Call and his Kentish rebels to kneel in prayer on Blackheath before they proceeded to march on London in 1450. Babies have been brought here to be baptised, couples have come here to be married, and funeral rites have been read before people have been buried beneath this sacred turf. It's estimated that over the centuries more than 5,000 people have been interred here. 3 Astronomers Royal are buried in this churchyard. Edmund Halley, the best known, in this simple chest tomb under the garage wall. Most people remember him as an astronomer and as the discoverer of Halley's Comet. But he was also a distinguished meteorologist, geomagnetist and cartographer. He was Astronomer Royal for 20 years, between 1720 and 1742, and he died at the age of 83 when he was buried in this simple tomb. This slab is a 19th century replacement for the original, but that can still be seen in the Royal Observatory Museum in Greenwich Park, where you can read a moving tribute in Latin which is written across the top. The opening sentence of that tribute, when translated, reads, "Beneath this marble peacefully lies beside his beloved wife, Edmund Halley, LLD." About 10 metres to the north, in 1801, Sir John Call was buried beneath this very fine monument, recently given a Grade 2 star listing. After a distinguished military career in India, Call retired to London, where he practised banking, represented the city as an MP, and lived in the manor house of Old Road long before it became today's library. Nearby is the vault to the Locke family. George Locke earned the right to be buried in this churchyard the hard way. He was rector of St Margaret's for 61 years between 1803 and 1864, and he preached and led services in all 3 churches, in the medieval church, in the short-lived second church, and in the early days of the 3rd church built on the south side of Lee Terrace. In the 1820s, Locke was a close friend of Lady Caroline Brunswick, the estranged consort of the Prince of Wales, later to be George IV. She was a one-time resident of the Ranger's House on Blackheath and a regular worshipper in the second church of St Margaret's. George Locke died in his 94th year in 1864 and is buried here in the family vault. Despite a considerable amount of weathering and vandalism, across the churchyard has survived one of the most flamboyant of all Georgian churchyard memorials in London. It's attributed to Robert Chambers and is designed in a flamboyant, sepulchral Rococo style. It houses the remains of Sir Thomas and Sir Samuel Fludyer. Sir Samuel was the Lord Mayor of London who hosted the banquet for the coronation of George III in the Guild Hall in 1761. Up until the early 1970s, there was a very elegant wooden canopy that protected this wonderful monument from bad weather, and it too has recently been given a Grade 2 star listing. Nearby is the vault of the Boone family. Originally from Somerset, Christopher and Mary Boone moved to Lee in the early 1670s, where they lived in Lee Place. On their death, parents, respectively in 1683 and 1721. They were buried in the Boones Chapel near Lee Place. But between 1745 and 1819, all subsequent members of the family were buried in this vault. The last of them, a great nephew of Christopher, was Charles Boone, and he died in his 90th year in 1819. He was a well-known local eccentric, and he left strict instructions in his will that food and wine should be left in this vault for his planned return 50 years later, a commitment, sadly, that he failed to honour. Less distinguished architecturally, but no less interesting for that, is this tomb to Robert Cocking, the brave but over-ambitious balloonist who took off from Vauxhall Gardens in July 1837 in his newly invented contraption, but fell to a tragic death on Burnt Ash Hill when his very primitive parachute failed to open. The fall attracted much local and national publicity, and a ghoulish interest by the residents of Lee Green, as they crowded to see his mangled remains, which were collected in the old tiger's head 3 or 4 days before being buried here. It is perhaps appropriate that the last significant burial in this graveyard was that of George Locke in 1864. However, there were two interesting events that took place in the 20th century. In 1942, 12 large Hessian sacks full of the broken fragments of stained glass salvaged from the 10 Clayton and Bell windows destroyed by bombing were dragged over here and deposited in different vaults, in the hope they could be used in the restoration after the war. And in 1969, bodies originally interred in the crypt of the third church of St Margaret's on the south of Lee Terrace were reinterred here, so the crypt could be deconsecrated and used for social purposes. London has a number of urban necropoli dating from the 18th and 19th century, and all of them contain interesting and fine monuments and graves to famous and less famous people. Examples can be found in West Brompton, Kensal Green, Highgate, Hackney, Stoke Newington, Wandsworth, West Norwood and Nunhead. All form an important part of London's architectural heritage. However, none are as compact or as potentially accessible, interesting and pleasant as this graveyard could be as a public garden or park where local residents could relax and local schools and other organisations could organise art and history sessions.